Hi, this is Heidi Burgess with part 5 as my Business as Usual series. This time I want to look at the relationship between rationality and emotions in conflict and decision making. I've been teaching a class at the University of Colorado, a face-to-face class, on conflict skills. And at the beginning of the semester, I asked students to make a self-assessment about what they're good at when they engage in conflict, and what they're not good at, and what they would like to get better at. And a very common answer that I get is that they say that they get too emotional or non-rational, and they want to stop doing that. They want to start being able to think more rationally and make decisions more rationally when they're engaged in conflict. So what they think is that they need to put a box around emotions and what I'm calling here non-rational thought, and there I'm making a reference to things such as intuition and stereotypes and beliefs that aren't based on any sort of causal relationship, at least not any explicitly known causal relationship, but just feelings. So they feel like that they want to put a box around that sort of thing and ideally shrink them so that they can be overwritten or ignored, and the decisions that they need to make and the engagements that they have with the people they're conflicting with can be done entirely in a rational way. Their fear, of course, is that emotions will run rampant and they'll have a big blow up and they'll scream and they'll yell and they'll cry and they'll get all upset, and emotions will completely overwhelm reason. Well, neither of these outcomes are good, of course, and the notion that you can overwhelm emotions with reason isn't even particularly realistic. And we spend a week dealing with the relationship between emotions and reason in that class, and I'm going to do it here in about 3 or 4 minutes, I hope. What I teach is that both aspects of decision making and conflict are always present. You can't completely subsume one or the other under the other one. But most often, emotions and non-rational thought influence our rationality more than the other way around. I have them read and I talk about a monograph written by Mari Fitzduff, which is called An Introduction to Neuroscience for the Peace Builder. I'll have a citation for that on the next slide. I didn't have room for it on this slide. In that monograph, Mary talks about emotions being a lot like an elephant and the elephant's trainer and rider, as shown in this picture, where the trainer is the rational aspect of decision making and the elephant is the non-rational thought. The elephant, of course, is much stronger, much more powerful, and if it decides that it's going to do what it wants to do contrary to the trainer, it's going to do it. The trainer is pretty much helpless. On the other hand, the trainer does exert some control, and if he cajoles the elephant and works with it carefully, he can usually get it to do what he wants it to do. Similar ideas were presented in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which we also talk about in this class. Thinking fast, of course, is emotions and non-rational thought. Thinking slow is rationality. And Kahneman, too, says that you have both. They're not avoidable, and you have to learn how to work with them together. So here's a citation for that book. You can get it online. I'll have the citation in a clickable form in the transcript. And one of the key ideas in that monograph is, and this is a direct quote, I should have put quotes around it, for change to happen, we need to be both emotionally and rationally engaged. I did put a quote around the longer quote at the bottom, which I'm including despite the fact that it's a lot of black and white, because I think it's important. Mary says, many of us, meaning peace builders, have a filing cases full of possible rational approaches to all of the conflicts in which we are working. However, for people to actually approach that filing cabinet and its possible solutions, they also need to be emotionally motivated to do so, which is often a harder process to manufacture than any reasoning in favor of particular solutions. So going back to this slide, the elephant has to be emotionally inclined to do what the rider is asking it to do. Otherwise, it's going to go off on its own. So we have to engage with the emotions as well as the reason in any effective conflict resolution, in any effective decision-making process. When I teach it in my skills class, I spend most of the week using a metaphor of Yellowstone National Park. And I show a picture of the geyser Old Faithful and talk about how that is an explosion. And then I liken what you see at Yellowstone to Stone, Patton, and Heen's book, Difficult Conversations. They talk about 3 different layers to every difficult conversation. They actually call them different conversations, but I tend to refer to them as layers because I think it's a little less confusing. And they say that at the top, I've got that on the next slide, I show this in terms of the Yellowstone River and Yellowstone Canyon. The top layer is the what happened layer, which is the obvious layer. It's the thing that you see if you're just looking at the surface. But underneath that is what they call the feelings layer, which of course is the emotions. And then underneath that is what they call the identity layer, and I add to that security and justice, because their notion is that when there are attacks to a person's identity, that arouses strong feelings, which influences what happens in the conversation. So their argument is that you have to start down at what they call the identity level, and I'll go back to this slide, to stop the eruption from pressure from building up and the eruption from coming. So you have to work down at the identity level to see what the affronts were to a person's identity and try to deal with them to prevent an explosion. I add in security and justice because I think attacks on a person's sense of security and treating people unjustly can also lead to the same sort of explosion that attacks to identity will lead to. So we spend an entire week talking about how you can identify and deal with attacks to identity, security, and justice in order to indeed control or at least understand the feelings layer and then have influence on the what happened layer. So the influence goes both ways, from the bottom to the middle to the top, and then back down again in cycles. So the bottom line here is that you need to engage all 3 layers, including the emotions and the non-rational thought, if you are going to prevent an explosion and be able to deal with disputes and conflicts rationally and emotionally at the same time. So once again, I want to end with some questions. The first one is, what's the proper balance between non-rational and rational drivers of decisions? Should you try to make it 50-50? Should you try to preference rationality, being aware of the fact that emotions are driving that? Or do you really engage with the emotions first and foremost? Once you decide what the proper balance is, how do you attain that yourself within your own decision-making process? And how do we attain that balance at the group or even the national level? You may have an idea of what you think is right for you, but how can we get everybody else to engage in conflicts that way as well?